Jeff Bezos funded a clock inside a mountain in West Texas. Not on the mountain, inside it. Buried deep in rock, built to keep time for 10,000 years. Officially, it's a monument to long-term thinking. But when powerful people start building inside mountains, you have to ask a different question. What are they preparing for? Maybe it is just a clock. But it exists in a world where governments already build underground survival infrastructure, and where Earth's magnetic field is doing something strange. Over the last few decades, the magnetic North Pole has been racing away from Canada towards Siberia far faster than it used to. In 2019, the world magnetic model had to be updated early because the drift was outpacing expectations, and a giant weak spot in Earth's magnetic field over the South Atlantic has kept growing. This isn't coming from random internet theorists. These are the agencies that help keep global navigation working. And then there's the strangest part. A once classified CIA document preserves a theory that claims these kinds of geomagnetic changes may come before a civilization-ending event. The document was held from the public for half a century. When it was finally released, pages were missing. The missing section was titled Aftermath. Someone decided you didn't need to know what comes after. So what exactly did this theory claim, and why was anyone in government taking it seriously enough to bury it? The man behind it was Chan Thomas, an engineer and Cold War-era researcher with a reputation for thinking far outside the academic mainstream. In the 1960s, he wrote a book called The Adam and Eve Story. His claim was simple and insane. Human civilization is not living through a stable age of Earth. It's living between resets. Thomas argued that Earth's outer crust is not locked in place forever. Under the right conditions, it could slip over the layers beneath it like a shell, moving over a softer interior. But these forces fail. Periodically, cyclically, with the terrible reliability of a mechanism that's been running since before life existed on this planet. Here's the sequence Chan Thomas describes. Thomas believed the shift would happen fast, in hours, not millennia. The land moves, the oceans keep their momentum. The result is global catastrophe. Winds of 1,000 miles per hour, walls of seawater 2 miles high racing across continents, regions that were temperate becoming polar in hours, regions that were polar sliding toward the equator, the molten sublayer breaching the surface as the crust cracks and tears, white-hot liquid rock erupting across the landscape as the ground itself tears open. Chan Thomas maps this sequence in specific phases. The initial shift, 6 to 12 hours of cataclysmic violence that ends civilization as a functional system. 6 days of continued earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and continental flooding as the new crust stabilizes. On the 7th day, and Thomas notes this deliberately, the Earth rests. The oceans settle in new basins. The continents hold new positions. The ice that was at the equator begins to melt over the following 25 years, raising sea levels by 200 feet. Every civilization, every city, every record, every library, every piece of accumulated knowledge, gone in a single day. Thomas wasn't writing in a total vacuum. Earlier researchers like Charles Hapgood had also argued that Earth's surface might shift catastrophically under the right conditions. Albert Einstein even wrote that Hapgood's ideas deserved serious examination. For most of recorded history, magnetic north drifted at about 10 kilometers per year. Between 1990 and 2005, it began accelerating. By the early 2000s, it was moving at 50 to 60 kilometers per year. a rate Dr. William Brown of the British Geological Survey has described as something we've never observed before. In the past 20 years, it's traveled from the Canadian Arctic towards Siberia at a pace that's forced continuous recalibration of every navigation system on Earth. Before we go further into what this means for the present, we need to go back much further into the past. Because the most extraordinary section of Chan Thomas's work isn't the geophysics, it's the mythology. Thomas argues that the cataclysm isn't merely a scientific hypothesis. It's the most documented event in human history. It just isn't recognized as documentation because the people who preserved the record encoded it in the only format that survives everything: story. Chan Thomas begins with Genesis. In his analysis, the first 3 chapters of Genesis have been mistranslated, not accidentally, because the original text was written in a prehistoric glyph language he calls Naga, a parent tongue related to early Mayan and Sumerian. And when Moses and later scribes encountered these symbols, they read them literally rather than as the geophysical metaphors they were intended to convey. In Thomas's translation, Genesis isn't a creation myth. It's a survival account, a record of what happened to the civilization that existed before the last cataclysm, 11,500 years ago. The Garden of Eden isn't a literal garden, it's a continent, the homeland of an advanced civilization, what we might call Atlantis, a land described as perfect, abundant, a golden age of civilization. The tree of knowledge isn't a tree, it's the parent civilization itself, the accumulated knowledge of a society that had developed over thousands of years without interruption. The serpent isn't a reptile, it's the ocean, the encroaching water, the 2-mile wall of seawater that raced across the continent as the crust shifted and the Atlantic basin inverted. The flaming sword blocking the return to Eden isn't supernatural fire, it's volcanic earth fire, the molten sublayer breaching the surface of the continent as it tears apart and slides toward its new position. The cherubim placed to guard the garden aren't angels. They're the geological forces, the fire and the flood, that make the land permanently unreachable. The homeland isn't lost because humanity sinned, it's lost because the crust moved. It's now at the bottom of an ocean or buried under a glacier or located at coordinates that correspond to nothing on the current surface map of the world. And Adam and Eve aren't the first humans, they're survivors, people who made it through. Thomas argues that Eve's rib, long interpreted as a mystical act of divine creation, is a mistranslation of a Naga glyph representing parentage or shared lineage. Eve wasn't made from Adam, Eve was Adam's daughter. She carried the ancestral memory, the knowledge of what had been and what had happened, into the new world that emerged after the waters receded. This reframing does something profound to the entire structure of subsequent mythology. The story of Noah isn't a unique event. It's the same event, preserved in a different cultural tradition, as is the Sumerian flood account in the Epic of Gilgamesh, which predates the biblical version by over 1,000 years and describes the same catastrophe, the same divine warning to a single individual, the same survival by vessel, the same landing on a mountain as waters recede. Flood mythology exists in virtually every human cultural tradition on every continent, including cultures that had no contact with each other. The Okanagan people of the Pacific Northwest, the Maya, the tribes of coastal India, the Aboriginal Australians, the Yoruba, they all preserved a memory of water, a great rising, an end of the world as it was. Not metaphor, memory. And here's where the mythology becomes most interesting. Because across the flood traditions of the ancient world, the survivors of the catastrophe aren't left alone to rebuild from nothing. In culture after culture, across civilizations that had no documented contact with each other, the same figure appears after the flood, tall, pale, luminous, arriving from the sea or the sky, teaching agriculture, architecture, astronomy, law, then leaving. The Sumerians called them the Apkallu, 7 sages who emerged from the ocean to rebuild civilization. The Andeans had Viracocha, a white, bearded figure who taught them to build and govern, then walked into the sea. In Mesoamerica, Quetzalcoatl. In Egypt, the Aku, the Shining Ones, recorded as the civilization bringers who came before the pharaohs. The Dogon of West Africa preserved the Nomo, beings from the sky who brought knowledge and departed. Different cultures, no documented contact, same figure, same story, same exit. White beings, luminous beings, appearing after catastrophe, bringing the knowledge that was lost, then leaving. The most obvious question is, where did they come from? If the last cataclysm wiped every surface civilization 11,500 years ago, where were these knowledge bearers before the flood? Where were they during it? How did they survive what killed everything else? Chan Thomas's theory provides one answer. The same answer that's been circulating in esoteric traditions for centuries. They went underground. There's a concept in alternative history research, and in the esoteric traditions of virtually every ancient culture, of a civilization that exists beneath the surface. Not metaphorically, physically, underground. In Tibetan Buddhism, it's Shambhala. In Hindu tradition, it's Agartha. In Norse mythology, the deepest roots of Yggdrasil reach into a realm beneath the world. The Hopi speak of previous worlds beneath the current one, entered and exited through a sipapu, a tunnel in the earth. The Cherokee, the Inuit, the Aztec, whose creation myths describe humanity emerging from underground into the current world. The specific details vary. The consistent claim across all of them is that beneath the surface there's a civilization, a preserved civilization, one that's been there through previous ages of the surface world, one that possesses the knowledge that surface civilizations repeatedly lose when the crust resets. If the catastrophic cycle is real, if every 5,000 to 7,000 years the surface is effectively sterilized and the process of civilization has to begin again from survivors, then a civilization with sufficient forewarning and sufficient technology to go underground before the event would be effectively immortal. Each reset affects the surface. The depths remain. The beings who appear after every flood, luminous and white and carrying knowledge. The Apkallu, Viracocha, Quetzalcoatl, the Shining Ones, may not have survived the flood miraculously. They may have been underground during it, and they emerged afterward not as survivors of the catastrophe, but as inhabitants of a permanent civilization that's been running continuously beneath the surface through multiple cycles of surface destruction and recovery. This isn't, it should be noted, a claim that requires purely exotic technology. The deepest mines in the world descend nearly 4 kilometers. The deepest natural cave systems extend for hundreds of kilometers horizontally. A civilization with sufficient engineering capability and forewarning of the cycle could construct habitable deep underground facilities that'd be completely unaffected by a crustal shift at the surface. The crust moves. The deep bedrock far below the transition layer doesn't. What they'd need is knowledge of the cycle. Precise calendrical knowledge of when the crust unlocks. The ancient calendar systems are worth examining with this in mind. The Mayan long count calendar ends a cycle, the 5th Sun Age, at a point corresponding to 2012 in our calendar. This is frequently misread as a doomsday prediction. It isn't, it's a cycle marker. The Aztec calendar similarly tracks 5 ages of the world, each ended by a different catastrophe. Flood, wind, fire, a rain of ash. The current age, the 5th sun, is scheduled to end in a catastrophe related to movement. The Hindu Yuga cycle describes 4 epochs of the world moving from a golden age to increasing degradation with a complete reset before the cycle begins again. These aren't primitive attempts to predict the future. They're records of the cycle built into the calendrical infrastructure of every major ancient civilization. The underground civilizations of legend, Agartha, Shambhala, aren't described as places of exile or desperation. They're described as Golden Age civilizations, places where the knowledge of the previous cycle was preserved intact. The beings who emerge after each flood bearing knowledge aren't survivors who barely made it. They're curators, representatives of the continuous civilization below, seeding the surface with enough foundational knowledge to rebuild each time from the same template, which would explain something that the mainstream historical record acknowledges without fully confronting: the extraordinary similarity between the foundational elements of ancient civilizations that had no contact with each other. The Sumerian number system and the Mayan calendar both use sophisticated mathematical frameworks that couldn't have been independently developed in the time frames mainstream archaeology assigns to them. The pyramids at Giza and the Pyramid of the Sun at Teotihuacan share geometric and astronomical alignments that point to a common knowledge base. The mythological frameworks of cultures separated by oceans share structural elements that are too specific for coincidence. They were all taught by the same teachers. The teachers who come up after the flood, build the foundations, and go back down. Now, Chan Thomas predicted the next event around the year 2000. That prediction was off by at least a generation, and it's been 30 years since that deadline passed without civilization ending. But here's what Thomas's prediction was based on: the timing of the previous cycle. He was working backward from the geological record and the mythological record, estimating the interval between events and projecting forward. His estimate was imprecise. His mechanism was partially correct and partially outdated. He was working in the 1960s without satellite magnetometry, without the geomagnetic data that have given him the South Atlantic anomaly's growth rate, without the orbital mechanics data that have told him exactly when the solar system crosses the galactic current sheet. Of course, a failed prediction matters. It means Thomas did not know the timing, if the mechanism exists at all. But being wrong about the date is not the same thing as disproving every part of the model. What doesn't come and go is the magnetic field data. What keeps the theory alive for some researchers is not Thomas's calendar. It's the present-day magnetic data. The question is not whether a catastrophe is happening tomorrow. It's whether we are looking at the early phase of something larger and still don't know the timeline. In 2018, Jeff Bezos, then the richest man on Earth, began construction on a project inside a mountain in the Sierra Diablo range of West Texas. He's invested $42 million of his own money. The project involves drilling deep into solid rock, building a 500-foot chamber inside the underground clock chamber, and installing a clock designed to run for 10,000 years. The stated purpose is to encourage long-term thinking, to remind humanity that our civilization exists on a timescale longer than a news cycle. Ask yourself why the richest man in the world would spend $42 million on a clock inside a mountain. Ask why it had to be inside a mountain specifically. The Long Now Foundation, which manages the project, cites the preservation environment: high desert, underground, away from the temperature fluctuations and humidity of the surface world. Ideal for something designed to last. The same characteristics that make it ideal for a clock make it ideal for a shelter. The continuity of government infrastructure isn't rumored, it's documented. Raven Rock Mountain Complex in Pennsylvania, the underground Pentagon, is an entire city buried inside a mountain, staffed, operational, equipped with its own power plant, water reservoirs, dining facilities, communications infrastructure. Mount Weather Emergency Operations Center in Virginia, 600,000 to 700,000 square feet of underground space managed by FEMA. Cheyenne Mountain Complex in Colorado, 5 acres of hardened facilities embedded in 9,000 feet of granite, built with 2 tons of dynamite per day, capable of surviving direct nuclear strikes. These are the acknowledged facilities, built officially for nuclear war continuity. But nuclear war preparedness doesn't require the specific design elements these facilities share. Nuclear war doesn't last 25 years. Nuclear fallout, while devastating, doesn't rearrange the continents. The design parameter of these facilities, self-sufficient for extended indefinite periods, hardened against surface-level catastrophic events, positioned deep inside solid mountain bedrock, maps onto the crustal displacement scenario considerably better than it maps onto a nuclear exchange. Add in the seed vaults, the biodiversity backups, the long-term archives, even projects meant to preserve human knowledge for deep time, and a pattern emerges. Modern civilization already builds insurance policies against collapse. The only real question is collapse from what? The Svalbard Global Seed Vault, buried in permafrost in the Arctic, the Global Crop Diversity Trust, established by the United Nations specifically to preserve agricultural biodiversity against unspecified catastrophic threats. The Voyager Golden Records, 2 physical discs sent to interstellar space in 1977, carrying images, sounds, music, mathematical information, and the location of Earth, designed to survive the destruction of human civilization and communicate its existence to whatever intelligence might find them billions of years from now. Ben Davidson, one of the modern researchers building on Thomas's framework with current geophysical data, has made a specific and documented claim about why that classification matters. The public-facing version of the crustal displacement theory that gained traction in the mainstream, Charles Hapgood's version, the one that received Albert Einstein's foreword, is, in Davidson's analysis, a deliberately simplified and easily debunkable version of the real theory. Hapgood's mechanism is scientifically weak. The mainstream objections to it are valid and well documented, and as a result of those objections, the entire field of serious catastrophism has been categorized as fringe pseudoscience by association. Davidson argues this wasn't an accident, that by making Hapgood the public face of the theory, ensuring that the easily attacked version was the widely known version, those who understood the real mechanism created a situation where anyone who raised serious questions about catastrophic cycles would be immediately associated with a discredited framework. The field was poisoned at the well, and the book that contained a more accurate, more dangerous version of the theory was quietly pulled from circulation and filed in a government archive with redactions covering the section about what to do after. Set aside the PSYOP angle for a moment. The documented facts alone are enough. The CIA had the book. They classified it. They released a version with pages missing. The magnetic field is shifting in ways that have no modern precedent. The wealthiest people on Earth are building things inside mountains designed to last 10,000 years. The government maintains a documented network of deep underground facilities built for extended survival of catastrophic surface events. And virtually every ancient culture on Earth encoded a detailed account of the last time something like this happened. Chan Thomas assembled all of it in 1965. The government read it, then they buried it. They didn't classify it because it was wrong. Here's the question that sits at the center of this. If the cycle is real, if the planet undergoes a total surface reset every 5 to 7,000 years, if the geological record and the mythological record and the magnetic field data all point to a mechanism that's currently in some phase of activation, what's the correct response? There are 2 options. The first is disclosure. Tell people. Give the population the information needed to prepare, to make decisions, to choose how to spend whatever time remains before the next event. Accept the social consequences, the panic, the disruption, the collapse of long-term economic and institutional planning as the price of honesty. The second is selective preservation. Identify the people, the knowledge, the genetic material, and the institutional frameworks most worth preserving through the reset. Build facilities, stockpile seeds, send records into space, construct the infrastructure of the next cycle's recovery, and keep the surface population calm and productive and unaware until the window for broad-scale preparation is closed. The evidence visible in the documented record suggests option 2 has been in progress for decades. The question this raises about who decides who goes underground, about what criteria determine inclusion in the next civilization, about whether the civilization that emerges from the mountain is continuous with the one that went in, is the question the aftermath section of Sean Thomas's book would have addressed. We don't have that section. It was redacted. But we've the mythological record, we've the testimony of every ancient culture that preserved the memory of the last time this happened. And what that record describes, the emergence of luminous white beings bearing knowledge, establishing civilization, maintaining the template through multiple resets, suggests that the underground civilization has been running this protocol for longer than our current historical record extends. The Garden of Eden was real. It wasn't a myth. It was a memory of the last golden age, preserved in the oldest texts humanity possesses, encoded in the language of a people who understood, on some level, that what had been would be again. The flaming sword is still there. The path back to the Garden of Eden is blocked, and somewhere deep in the geological infrastructure of this planet, in facilities that predate our current civilization, by timescales our history books don't account for, the curators are waiting for the surface to stabilize again. They've done this before. They'll do it again. The only question, the one the magnetic field data and the government archives and the seed vaults and the 10,000-year clock inside the West Texas mountain all refuse to answer directly, is whether this time we're the surface civilization or the underground civilization.